It's the task of nations or even United Nations by troops gathered by or achieved by member states of United Nations, but not of NATO. Second question, I don't consider your question as a challenging one, because in Germany we really speeded up during the last month. Last week we gave to the committee in the parliament more than 20, Vorlagen, drafts for procurement, which is much more than they got before during 10 months. So we are really speeding up for ammunition of different kinds. We made a contract for helicopters with a government-to-government deal with the United States. We made for ships for our Navy, and of course for Leopard tanks, a framework contract with other nations in Europe. So we are really speeding up, so we don't need any more contracts, well, maybe some, but not so much anymore, because that's what you said, Paul, is quite very important. We can't do contracts for 20 years, and the company who gets this contract can print its money on its own by this contract. So we have always to obey the rules for preparing procurements and to make contracts.
Well, that was very German efficiency. You got 2 answers in a minute. Well done. Thank you, sir. Any final thoughts?
I try my very best.
I'll be very brief. I have 2 sort of concluding thoughts. The one is, you have seen very clearly we have commitment from the NATO alliance, from these 3 great nations. The fact that Sweden will be soon amongst us is really important. The defense industrial base across the transatlantic area is a strategic resource, just as all of our military commitments. And so that's one of the things our leaders will be looking at today, is to really send a strong signal that it's not just governments who invest, there is private investment and others into that defense industrial base as one of the assets that we have to ensure that our deterrence and defense is effective.
Well, we could have gone on for 2 more hours, but I know you have an important meeting and you have to go to, obviously, your different delegations, so we appreciate your time. Thank you very much. Round of applause, and also a round of applause for the audience. Thank you very much.
Пасаки когда? Many thanks to the panelists and the moderator of the latter for the amplification of the defense investment topic. This was a very timely discussion, very much in sync with the current agenda of the NATO summit in Vilnius, Lithuania. And now we are going to have yet another important part of our program, and that is lunch break. So we will be back here in this room at 14:45 Lithuania time. Enjoy your lunch and use this opportunity to share your impressions.
Hello and welcome to the NATO Public Forum YouTube studio. I'm Jack Caddy from TLDR News, and I'm joined by Admiral Rob Bauer, the chair of the Military Committee of NATO.
Hello.
Very nice to meet you. Thanks for joining us.
Nice to meet you, Jack.
I'm going to dive straight into Ukraine, which is obviously the big topic being discussed both here and around the world. Just last week, you warned about underestimating Russia's ability to bounce back in the war and more generally. How do you think NATO's new plans help to protect against the continued threat of Russian aggression?
The plans are basically based on the Russian threat and the threat from terror groups. So we are in a very good position with these plans, but it's not only about the plans. We need now, the nations need now, to do what is necessary to make those plans work. So this is about executability of the plans, because if you are looking at collective defense, it's basically the timelines is based on the enemy. So if someone attacks you, you have to be ready. There's not a lot of time if you are attacked and when you are attacked. So that is why it is so important to have more forces at a higher readiness level, that we are going to really buy the capabilities that we need, or air defense systems or whatever that is part of the package of capabilities that we need to successfully deter and defend against those two threats. So it's great to have the plans, which is very historic, and it's an enormous amount of work to get there, but it is now time to make them executable.
And part of that obviously is involving kind of spending targets around the world. NATO members collectively increased their defence spending by 8.3% in real terms last year, which is a record level of spending. But there are some NATO members that are still below the 2% target. Do you think that NATO is doing enough to guarantee security for the future? And is there anything more that could be done there?
So the good news is that since 2014, when the first discussion was on the Defence Investment Pledge, the decision in Wales then was we're going to move towards 2%, and then 20% of the defence budget invested in capabilities, and no more lower budgets in absolute terms. And I think that has been a success in a way that NATO has seen a huge increase in the defence budgets across the board. Some are moving faster than others. And I think part of the discussion here in Vilnius will be, what is the new defence investment pledge? Is 2% the ceiling or is it the floor? And I think we are moving towards 2% as a floor, and that then helps us to actually have the money available for all these investments that are necessary. So I think the decision that will be taken in the coming days are very important again, because they basically assure that there is sufficient money to do the things that are necessary. But we cannot do it alone, because there's another factor that is very important, and that is the defense production capacity. So the defense industries in, let's say, Europe and North America. And we've seen, again, with a war, as we saw with the pandemic, that just in time, just enough, which has been driving our economies for decades, is actually too late and not enough. And therefore, we need to ramp up the production capacity, but it is it's a private sector. So we need to talk to financiers. We need to convince people to really invest more in defense industry, so that the armed forces get the capabilities faster when they order them. And I think that is parallel to all the things we do in NATO. We need to work on that as well.
Absolutely. We obviously heard massive news yesterday that Turkey's President Erdogan would be ready to ratify Sweden's accession into NATO. I'm interested on your perspective of what Sweden will add to NATO's collective security.
Well, the good news for all of us is that with the accession of Finland and Sweden, of course, we have more territory to defend, which is a concern, might be a concern to some. But the good news is they bring very capable forces to help us and to help themselves and to help us as a collective. So I think we are in a very good position with those two nations, because they have very modern armed forces, because they were working with us already for a long time. So the integration in military terms in our armed force, in the structures, in the military structures, is going to be very easy. as we now see with Finland already.
Yes.
And militarily, there's another advantage, and that is that the defense of the Baltic region will become easier for NATO. Because basically, so the vulnerability for nations like the Baltic states and Poland is going down because of Finland and Sweden to their north and northeast. So I think in many ways it is good news. It is contrary to what Putin wanted. He wanted less NATO. He gets more NATO.
Yeah.
He wanted a less united NATO. He has a more united NATO. So in many ways he made a strategic mistake, with terrible consequences for Ukraine. But I think in terms of our alliance, it has strengthened the alliance in a way that nobody basically foresaw.
Absolutely. Moving away from Europe and Ukraine for the moment, how do you think that NATO should be responding to Russia and China, to a lesser extent, interest in the Arctic?
The Arctic has always been an important area for NATO. But again, with the accession of Finland and Sweden, 7 out of the 8 nations in the Arctic Council are NATO members.
Yes.
So we are better placed, so to say, to respond to threats from the high north. And if climate change increasingly will lead to an opening of the northern route, there's another threat access, so to say, from the north that can be used by Russia in practical terms and theoretically also by China. But that means that we also already have our regional plans focusing on the high north as well.
Yeah.
So we are looking at this. We are making sure together with the nations that are close to the high north that we have the right capabilities, that we have the plans in place to actually do what is necessary to protect us in that region as well.
And finally, how much attention do you think NATO should be paying in the Indo-Pacific as we head into the future?
Yeah, so NATO will remain a regional alliance, and it's not likely that nations from the Indo-Pacific will become a member.
Yes.
So that is not what we're talking about. So we're not looking to enlargement to the Far East, as you sometimes even hear. That is not the situation. But what we see with the security problems in the world, security problems are global. So the consequences of what happens in Ukraine is also felt in the Far East, in the Indo-Pacific. And therefore they are helping Ukraine.
Yes.
They are helping Ukraine as well with financial help, with weapons and non-lethal aid. So it's 50 nations that help Ukraine, not only NATO nations. And so the consequences of instability and insecurity is felt globally. It has almost immediately global consequences. Therefore, we talk to the Asia-Pacific partners, Australia, New Zealand, Japan and South Korea. And they want to talk to us because what happens in Ukraine can happen in their region as well.
Yeah.
And then they want to have the contact with us. We don't have plans against China, military plans, because China is not seen as a threat, but as a challenge. And we will have to look what it means for our region if China would become more active. But for now, that is not, militarily, that's not the case. But the discussions with the Asia-Pacific nations especially is about how we cooperate in general terms, how we learn from each other, how we can help each other, both on the political and the military levels.
Very interesting. Thank you so much for your time, Admiral.
Okay.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back from the dinner. Please take your seats. Okay, lunch. And we will continue with the NATO Public Forum here in Vilnius, Lithuania. The next session will be with a group of members of parliaments across different countries, and one of them will be speaking French, so please take your interpretation receivers in case you need them. Shashank Yoshi, defense editor at The Economist, will introduce the speakers and will lead the conversation. I now invite panelists on stage.
Please take your seats. Thank you very much for joining us in our afternoon slot. Well done for making it from lunch. Well done for staying awake. Congratulations. We have an excellent panel here. I'm Shashank Joshi, defense editor at The Economist. A lot of the issues we've been discussing for the last several hours, whether that's Sweden, Turkey, defense spending, defense investment, deterrence and defense, these are all intimately connected to popular opinion, popular will. We have 4 elected representatives here who can talk about the role of parliaments and also the role of public opinion and public attitudes in their respective countries and how that affects all of the topics we've been addressing. And please let me briefly introduce all of them. We have the Honourable Victoria Chmielita Nielsen, who's the Speaker of the Lithuanian Parliament.
Hi. Pleasure to be here.
The Honourable Joël Garriaud-Maylam, French Senator, who's the President of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly.
Yeah.
The Honourable Jeanne Shaheen, US Senator and co-chair of the US Senate NATO Observers Group. And the Honourable Tom Tillis, Senator, who is co-chair of also the co-chair of the US Senate NATO Observers Group. Just to kick us off, Madam Speaker, could you begin very briefly just by giving us a sense of whether or why parliaments matter in all of this. I mean, a lot of these are issues where the executive branch dominates, decisions are taken by defence ministers, prime ministers. What is the role of parliaments? Are they relevant at all here in what we're doing?
I certainly believe so. And when today we live in the circumstances with the war in Europe, with Russia's brutal attack on Ukraine, it is obviously not just a regional problem. It is not just something that could be limited to two countries or, let's say, this area of the world. But it is an attack of the well-established rule-based international order. Among other things, it is also an assault on parliamentary democracy. And given the fact that parliaments are the ones that ultimately vote on defense budget, parliaments are the ones that make decisions on sending the soldiers overboard to other countries, I believe that, well, the role of parliaments is as important as ever, and definitely it would be a mistake and it would be impossible to understand if we would just stay behind and not engage more actively than ever. So parliamentary dimension has been very important since the war on Ukraine began. And I believe that this parliamentary diplomacy has also served good purposes and should continue to serve that as long as we find ourselves in very extraordinary circumstances, as we definitely do today.
Thanks very much. Senator Garriaud-Maylam, could I turn to you, please? And we'd just like to ask you a question about popular perceptions of NATO, particularly in an era in which the European Union has also been assuming more strategic responsibilities, doing more on strategic autonomy. Can you talk a little bit about how you see those differences and how they manifest in your work?
I mean, obviously, first of all, let me say how much I agree with what Victoria has just said. I mean, the parliamentary dimension is so important, and that's what we do at NATO Parliamentary Assembly. We work with all parliaments, parliamentarians for every country to try to reach a consensus, which we have reached in supporting Ukraine, which is very important, and we've been totally unanimous. And in fact, I presented our decisions to the heads of state just a few minutes ago, because that is so important. Regarding NATO and the European Union, obviously there has been a lot of strategic discussions about that issue within Europe, but there is a really growing support for NATO. As you know, in Europe, we have a history. Unfortunately, this is not my case at all. I love the United States. I studied there. I've lived there. And so it's not my case, but there has been sometimes some resentment coming from the leftist parties, especially. But, more and more, everybody recognizes how NATO is important. But we want to develop our European defense, but within the framework of NATO. There's no other possibility now. We need to work within NATO, but we need as well to spend much more on our defense spending. For instance, our Parliamentary Assembly has recommended that we spend 2% of our GDP on budget, and that it should be the minimum, because it's extremely important to make sure that we have enough security for all our territories, all the member states of NATO. And I'm just realizing that as a matter of principle, I always want to speak in French, because French is the second official language of NATO, and I've switched to English, so I really apologize for that. I apologize to the French speakers who may be listening and who will give me a bad time afterwards. So maybe for your next question, I'll switch back to French, if you allow me.
Thank you for indulging us.
The support is growing, to have a short answer to your question.
And can I ask just a quick follow-up to that before I move on, which is, could you just, I worry we're in a room and on a panel where there's a lot of like-minded thinking, and as you said, you're an Atlanticist and you grew up in the US. Could you just identify the risks to that support? What do you think are the major risks going forward?
Obviously, there are risks. We have all over Europe populist movements which are growing. And that's a big worry for us. And I mean, we've seen it recently in France. You must have seen it on the news. There's been a lot of turmoil, and we have to be very careful about that. And we have to explain over and over again what are the challenges for our common security. We've got to show how important that we are united, you know. We are stronger together, that we always say, but it is something which is so important. And I'm sure we'll manage, I'm sure we'll succeed, because there's no other way, and that people will start thinking. But it's true, we have a little network of very strong supporters of Russia. I mean, they are always the same, you know, the same people who were against vaccinations, the same people who are always against everything, and obviously now they support Russia. But I still do feel the majority of the French people and of all the other countries are realizing how important our unity is, because we cannot not support Ukraine, we cannot not support this common defense, and we've got to increase our defense spending. This is extremely important in every one of our countries.
Thank you, and that's a sensible place for me to go to you, Senator Tillis, because there's no denying, looking at the polls, that there is a partisan divide in attitudes to NATO in the US, and there are greater doubts in your party amongst some, not just over favorability of NATO, but also on support for aid to Ukraine. And certainly from a European perspective, there are jitters looking ahead to the coming months and years, where we ask how staunch is that support. Can I ask how you assess that picture, and whether you can assuage those concerns or nuance them in some way?
Well, first off, we're all one big happy family in the United States. And like all families, we have our differences. But the fact of the matter is, the support for NATO, even a couple of NATO conferences ago, where the narrative was that the United States was moving away from NATO, they thought it was outdated. Jean and I went to a NATO summit, reaffirmed on a bipartisan basis, we have support. And I would not have done that if I didn't think that my Republican colleagues, my supporters back home, supported NATO, supported our investment. I think that the only headwinds that we really face in the United States is the notion of burden sharing, and having everyone recognize this is a historic opportunity for us to build capabilities that the Ukraine invasion have obviated. There are areas that NATO needs to invest more in. There are areas that each member country of NATO must invest more in. And if we can come away from this conference and future conferences demonstrating that we understand what those vulnerabilities are, we understand areas of stress that have come over the last 18 months, that I'm completely convinced that we'll continue to have majority support among Republicans and Democrats. Even amongst the parties, we have our concerns. But I believe that they're all manageable in a democratic country like the United States, and I believe that our support for NATO, our support for the Ukraine effort will continue. But make no mistake about it, the single greatest political risk that we have is not having the member nations of NATO satisfy, not only, it's not a number, it suggests a capability, it suggests a capacity. And we understand, each one of us, what those deficiencies are. And we need to show progress there. With that progress, there's no doubt in my mind that the 75-year alliance will be a 150-year alliance.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Sheen, can I also ask you sort of to tackle the same question, but I also want to take up a specific issue where parliaments have played a role, not just in the sort of broad sense, but in a very specific sense. We know that one of Turkey's requests was congressional support for F-16 sales. Given last night's developments, I'm just curious as to how you see the mood in Congress having changed, and whether the decisive shift is underway, and what that means.
Well, just to reinforce what Senator Tillis said, we have a strong bipartisan delegation here from the Senate, and we are here to show our support for NATO, to show our support for continuing to do everything we can to support the courageous Ukrainians in this unprovoked war against Russia. So that is the reason we're here, and we agree, and I'm really pleased to hear you say that the Parliamentary Assembly agrees that the 2%, what we hope will be a floor, not a ceiling, is important to every country, because we need to make sure that we continue to have the capability that we see as so important. You know, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Empire, I think we had what we called a peace dividend. We thought, well, we don't have to prepare to fight anymore. We don't have to prepare for conflict. And what this Ukrainian war has shown us very starkly is that that is not the case, that we do have to prepare. I was very pleased to hear another breakthrough with Turkey on Sweden's accession into NATO. It's something that I think should have happened much faster, and I think there was sentiment. Senator Tillis and I led a letter in the Senate earlier this year to say that we are very concerned about providing F-16s and other military equipment to Turkey as long as the ratification of Sweden hangs out there. So I think that it would be very problematic. As important a NATO ally as I think Turkey is, and they are important, I think President Erdogan's movement on Sweden, I hope, is the next step in ensuring that Sweden is ratified into NATO in the coming weeks.
Thank you, Senator. I'm going to, in a moment, turn to the floor, and I'll select questions by hands up in a moment. But so think of your questions. But before I do that, I want to just very quickly address a rather simple question to all of you, and it's the one that is here on my iPad from our virtual audience. But it's also the question that's kind of hung over every panel here, which is, when do you think Ukraine will be able to join NATO? And the question I have is, we don't know the precise language we'll see in the communique, but I think it's fair to say we have a sense it may not go as far as Ukrainians and their sort of advocates would like in terms of extending an invitation and offering a concrete, specific, rapid, credible pathway. And I'm just curious as to your views on whether you think the balance is being struck appropriately right now, or whether mistakes are being made. So, Madam Speaker, perhaps I could start with you and go this way.
Yes, well, it's easy for me to speak, as I'm one of those that you refer to as advocates of Ukraine, and as well, of course, the parliament that I represent. So back in April, on April the 6th, Lithuania became the first parliament that voted unanimously on a resolution that stated specific aims of Vilnius NATO summit, and among those was invitation to Ukraine to become a member of alliance. So speaking today, just at the moment when the exact wording is being decided on, I can repeat that I think a very clear commitment to Ukraine on behalf of alliance is something that is necessary today. A very clear commitment not just on invitation and membership, but also on practical support, military support. Ukraine has to win, and the sooner it wins, the better. Better for all of us in the West, better for our alliance. And I think the only only thing that Russia is betting on is a long, difficult war that will put strain on our strategic patience, that will be undeniably affected by changes of our political cycles. And, well, we have a window of opportunity that would really be a pity, well, more than a pity to miss.
Madam Senator.
Totally agree. This is exactly what I told the heads of state earlier. the Parliamentary Assembly is 100% in favor of the accession of NATO, and we want this accession to arrive as soon as possible. We know there are problems. We know that within the NATO framework, we cannot accept a country which is at war. It is a principle. So that's why also we need to win this war as soon as possible, and we need to have all the efforts we can put on the table to help Ukraine to win that war as soon as possible. But I've also demanded, and obviously I'm talking in the name of my assembly, that a very clear path is put forward to say how we are going to achieve that. Obviously, it's impossible to say when it will happen, but what's important is that clear path is being drafted and that also we afford security guarantees to Ukraine, and not only to Ukraine, because we've got to consider the other countries of the region, and I'm thinking of Moldova. I mean, you know, there are other threats. We talk about Ukraine, but there's also Belarus. I mean, there's a huge worry regarding the whole geographical situation in that area, but we want to really press, and that's what we're doing in our parliaments. We've adopted resolutions in order to do just that, to push our governments to try to go as quickly as we can for Ukraine to become a member. This is so important. But Ukraine has got to win the war, and two, we've got to be able to help it. And I want to thank all the governments and all the states who have been very united. I know it's difficult. I know we have that problem in France. We weren't able to give as many munitions as we wanted to because there was just a practical problem. We never ever thought that a war with Ukraine would happen. Never thought about it. And I must thank our Lithuanian and Baltic states colleagues. We were the only ones to say, be careful, you're being naive. And yes, we were naive. We never ever thought a war could happen on the European soil. We never thought that Russia would do such a stupid thing as invading Ukraine. But now we've got to do everything we can.
Thank you. Senator Sheen.
Well, I basically agree with that sentiment that it's in NATO's interest to do everything it can to support Ukraine in ending the war. It's in democracies around the world and all of our interests that Ukraine is able to win this war. And so a clear path for joining NATO is important. A piece of that, though, also is the democratic reforms that are part of NATO. And I think Ukraine has continued to move along that path in a way that's very important. We need to continue to support them. We need to continue to support not just humanitarian aid, all of the military equipment that we've talked about, but also the potential to rebuild Ukraine after this war is over. And that's been part of these discussions here at NATO.
Are there any specific democratic reforms you have in mind?
Well, I think corruption is one of the worst challenges that so many countries are facing, and we need to make sure that we've addressed that corruption wherever it exists, whether it's in a new democracy or an older democracy. So that's one. Certainly making sure that human rights are addressed in the country is another important issue.
Thank you. Senator Tillis.
I would just add to what Senator Sheen, and I agree with what my colleagues have said. I think we should also keep in mind, think about your country being under attack. You could easily and rightfully focus on those challenges. Hello? Hello?
Ah, we have a backup. We have a backup here.
Oh. Excellent. I felt like Madonna. So I was, for those of you who serve or follow legislative politics, think about having the pressure of a country that is committing war crimes, occupying you illegally, and yet your parliaments meet to focus on the very reforms that we're talking about. We're talking about the rule of law. We're talking about corruption. We're talking about separate, co-equal branches of government, the sorts of norms that we all expect. The fact that they're taking up that legislation when they're under the threat of being attacked demonstrates to me Ukraine's commitment to achieving exactly what they need to be a member of NATO. There's work to be done, but in spite of the fact, for a year and a half they've been occupied, and in spite of all that we know that's going on there, it suggests to me that we have government leaders who are committed to the very reforms. So here we have to continue to sustain the effort. We have to beat Putin. We have to support Ukraine. We have to sustain that, and we have to make it very clear to Vladimir Putin that NATO and the family of countries, nearly 50, that are supporting the effort now are here for the long term. And that's not a proposition Putin can win.
Thank you very much. Okay, I will now take questions. I'll do them in 3 at a time. So there's one at the back over there. One over there, please. If you could make your way to the microphones. And was there any from over this side of the hall? Yeah, over there, please. Domitilla, I think that's you over there. Thanks. Please, go ahead.
Thank you very much indeed, Shashank. Benjamin Tallis, German Council on Foreign Relations. It seems as though there's a large spread agreement in the room about what is the right solution for European security, ultimately. But how do we actually get there? In a time of constrained budgets, why are we choosing the most expensive path? In a time of heightened insecurity, why are we choosing the most insecure path to get there? What are the obstacles that we therefore have to overcome, and where do they lie? In Washington, in Berlin, and elsewhere? Thank you.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. Oleksiy Goncharenko, member of the Parliament of Ukraine. Taking into account environmental threats, watch at Kakhovka Dam, awful catastrophe, nuclear threats from Russia. I think that formula that NATO will defend every inch of its territory looks a little bit outdated. It's impossible to do it just from NATO territory. So taking into account that Russia is deploying nuclear weaponry just several kilometers from here in Belarus, isn't it the time for United States to deploy nuclear weaponry in Eastern Europe, including Ukraine? Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Maria. I'm the Managing Director of Young Professionals in Foreign Policy. And I'm going to bring this back a little bit to the grassroots support and ask you about young people's involvement. And it's a two-part question. One part is, do you think young people are doing enough, engaged enough in security and defense topics, and especially in NATO topics? And the second part is NATO and local governments, parliaments doing enough to engage young people and listen to young people when it comes to these topics? Because we are the future who is going to be leading the countries, leading NATO. So is enough being done to listen to young people right now?
And let's have that last question too, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm Domitilla Sagramosa. I'm from the Department of War Studies at King's College in London. And I have a question which relates very much to public support for our actions in Ukraine. And as parliamentarians, I think this is one of the key issues. I mean, how do we ensure that publics in Europe and in North America sort of continue with a sort of unwavering support of our efforts in Ukraine? I think that we face serious challenges. Politicians are exploiting the issue. There is sometimes politicians which exploit sort of anti-Americanism, as was mentioned. And, you know, I mean, one of our biggest worries is if this war continues, that there is going to be a loss of support. So what kind of arguments can we bring? What kind of narratives and arguments can we put forward to convince those elements in the publics in NATO countries which you know, need some kind of reassurance that their efforts, their sacrifices are really worth it? For many, this is very clear. But for others, you know, it's a real challenge that we are constantly having to explain, you know, myself included. And I think that it's very important that we try to develop a sort of a line of argument, a narrative that really penetrates and explains in a very powerful way why this effort, this support of Ukraine is essential for our security.
Thank you. Thank you for all those excellent questions. I'll go this way. Senator Tillis, I'll begin with you. And we don't all have to tackle all the questions, but I think it would be good if you started with perhaps the punchiest of all of those, which was, is it time to deploy nuclear weapons to Eastern Europe? I realize it's not up to the Senate to decide such a thing on its own, but this is the question of Europe's NATO nuclear posture is a live one. We have a very good panel on this coming up later in the afternoon, so we'd love to hear your views on that to begin with.
I'm not sure I'm there yet, and I'm glad to see my friend. We saw each other. He's from Ukraine parliamentarian, and I think he's making the right sort of request. I'm not really sure that I'm there yet, and the reason is Ukraine is doing such an extraordinary job fighting a war that Russia thought was going to be over in 2 weeks. I think that we could easily create distractions away from continuing to sustain what has been an extraordinary performance on Ukraine's part. So I think that, in my opinion, with all due respect to my friend, that's a discussion for another day. But I think we run the risk of taking our attention off of a strategy that's working. And then also potentially even dividing parliaments over an issue that I don't believe is material to our success strategy in Ukraine.
Senator Sheen.
Well, I agree with that. I don't think it's... One of the things that I think the world is very concerned about is the potential to use nuclear weapons. And I don't think we help that debate by putting nuclear weapons in Eastern Europe. And I would hope that we would do everything we can to try and get Vladimir Putin to stop using rhetoric around tactical nuclear weapons. And the best way to do that is to continue to support Ukraine in this unjust, unprovoked war. And I would agree with the last questioner who talked about, how do we continue to build support in a democracy for this kind of an effort? Well, I would argue that it's going to be a lot cheaper to defeat Vladimir Putin in Ukraine than if he comes into Lithuania or the Baltics or Poland or other parts of Eastern Europe. And I'm concerned that if he wins in Ukraine, he is not going to stop. And that's going to cost us a lot more money than supporting Ukraine. I had a meeting with a number of women of the Ukrainian military last fall, and one of the things one of them said to me that has resonated so much that I say to my constituents, she said, give us the weapons in Ukraine so we can fight the Russians so that you don't have to. And when I say that to my constituents in New Hampshire, they understand that. They know that it's important for us as a democracy to support this effort. And there isn't a one-size-fits-all answer for everybody. This is a debate that we've got to continue to have with our constituents on a regular basis. And as leaders and parliamentarians, it's up to us to continue to make this case and to do it until Ukraine has won this war.
Senator.
Here again, I totally agree. But first of all, about nuclear weapons, that I would totally disagree at that stage, for the reasons you said, but also because we've got already nuclear deterrence in Europe. Britain and France do have this nuclear deterrence, and, this is a very strong dissuasion force. And, Putin is very aware of that, obviously, and I really don't think he would do such a stupid thing, but he's done other stupid things, obviously, before with Ukraine. But I don't think we should go further, and we should concentrate, as you both said, on, the winning strategy and helping Ukraine the best way. Regarding the other questions, yes, young people should be much more informed about the issues of defense and the risk for our democracy. And that's what we have to fight for. There's a lot of fake news, disinformation coming from the Russian side, which is gaining territory. In fact, I'm present very soon a report on fake news and Russian disinformation to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. It's incredible to see how good they are at it, and we need to be even better to promote the democracy, because the risk is enormous. As you said, if we lose Ukraine, all the other countries in the area are at risk. But it will go even further. I mean, obviously, we know that China is looking extremely carefully at what's happening with Ukraine. As you know, there's a very strong question with Taiwan, and, you know, we've got to be very careful about what's happening in that area of the world as well. And that's why we've got to win this war. I'm sorry, I feel I'm repeating myself all the time, but this is so important, and we've got to do it now and make as many efforts as we can to win it now. And that's why we are working within NATO Parliamentary Assembly with all our parliamentarians. And I know there are some members of the Bureau who are somewhere here coming from different countries, and obviously we all agree on that. And really the message is democracy. Democracy is so important. It's a word which has been losing some of its appeal for many young people due as well to all this disinformation. But it's very easy to compare the situation within all countries in Europe and in North America and what's happening in the countries where there's an autocratic regime. And the difference is just so obvious. You know, we don't have these 3,000 Belarus prisoners just because they dared to say they didn't agree with what their autocratic President Lukashenko was doing and saying. This is unacceptable. And I think that all young people can understand that, and they will help us. They will understand and they will help us put forward that idea. Because yes, in Africa as well, we see China and Russia at work trying to present some ideas which are wrong and using all or fragilities, because that's the problem of the democracies as well. It's an intrinsic problem. We are fragile because we respect everybody and we want to work together, and that's what it's all about. But there's a lot of work to be done and discussions to be held. But, you know, we parliamentarians are doing it as much as we can.
Thank you. Madam Speaker.
Yes, well, on a slightly provocative but also a very logical question on nuclear weapons. I think, well, it's a good point that it is supposed and was supposed to work as a deterrent. But, well, we cannot fail to see that Russia has been using a nuclear weapon with impunity. And it is logical that the more countries will want to acquire it as a means of defense if we continue giving in to blackmail of Russia. I think it's, well, there is no other way to put a stop to it than to say very clearly, very loudly, without any doubt of any shadow of doubt, that nuclear blackmail does not work on us, because else we open up the whole new sort of alley of debate that, well, it sounds like we would rather not have. On the engagement of youth, I think, you know, there is a very good saying that probably rings as true as ever now, that every generation has to win democracy. So for the young generation right now, well, there is no better example, also no more emotionally compelling example than seeing their counterparts in Ukraine go to defend their motherland, their country, their freedom, their democratic future on the front, or, well, even unfortunately dying in completely brutal and also senseless terroristic attacks of Russia. Well, if that cannot bring this urgency, then really nothing can. And I believe, looking at least to the youth in our country, in our region, that the support for NATO being record high, the support for transatlantic bond being record high, I think that, well, there is this understanding, and that we have every reason to look at our young people with a lot of hope that they will continue, and perhaps continue in a more efficient, effective way and emotionally engaged way than we did for a while, when it looked like we were almost at the, well, so-called end of history. And speaking of the engagement of, people in the course of supporting Ukraine, in the course of being on the side of NATO, about the skepticism. Well, I believe if there is any kind of silver lining to the brutal attack of Russia, is that newly founded, reinvigorated bond we have with our transatlantic partners. I think the understanding that the project, the security architecture that has been created after Second World War, which is very much a common project and that the United States of America has invested so much in, is actually under threat. And that we are all in, and our citizens, our constituents can hear this from us, parliamentarians. And I think that spreading this message is perhaps a single most important thing that we can do right now.
Okay, thank you. I think we have a little bit more time for questions. Anyone else would like to ask one? Just at the front over there, and at the back over there, please, if you two could make your way to the microphones.
Thank you very much for...
We can hear you.
It's okay?
I think we can hear. Can we everyone hear? Yes, I think so.
I listen very, very carefully what honorable parliamentarians say, and I see their support, parliamentarian support for NATO, and grassroots support for NATO. Is exactly what the honorable senator from New Hampshire say, that we need to explain to the people. You need to explain to your people, because the people provide the legitimacy of your efforts and your decision. And I like to put another dimension of another organization that maybe you know.
Could we have a brief question, please, because we've got such little time. I want to make sure we have enough time for answers.
Okay, very quick. I like to mention the Atlantic Treaty Association. Many of the participants here come from the Atlantic Councils of their respective country, of the Association Française pour la Communauté Atlantique, of the Greek Association, and is exactly support is the citizen society that support and give the legitimacy to your efforts and to NATO.
Sergei Sidorenko, European Pravda, Ukraine. I heard an idea of our French colleagues that there is a kind of proposal to have security guarantees not only to Ukraine but also to Moldova, as far as I understand. Could you please elaborate more, because I have never heard of that idea. So do you see that Moldova have to be a kind of supplied by weaponry like Ukraine is, or maybe some other form of security guarantees, given that they also have occupied territory? Thank you.
Okay, Madam Senator, why don't I start with you, please, and I'll change the order around.
Obviously, we're worried about Moldova. It's enough to look at a map of the region to see that Moldova is at risk, because obviously, you know, it's an access to the maritime area, and there is also this Transnistria region, which is under Russian, leadership. And this is a fragile area. That's why we're doing a lot to support Moldova. I've been there several times. I mean, we're really trying to help as much as we can the country, because we've got a democratic president who is being attacked by the Russian-minded and, Russian supporters. And we have to be very, very strong about it and, put as much as we can in order to help Moldova as well. But it's not the only country at risk. But Moldova, in my mind, in our minds, would be the first one at risk. I'm not sure I totally understood your question, and so I'm not sure I've answered fully to your question, but
that's fine. With such little time, we'll be fine. Sorry,
Which kind of security guarantees concretely to Moldova?
Well, first of all,
we have to be very brief, I'm afraid, because we have such little time
First of all, we've got to help from an economic point of view, because a country which is fragile from an economic point of view is fragile from a security point of view. And then obviously we've got to reinforce our forces, our NATO forces on the eastern flank, especially with troops in Romania, in the eastern part of Romania, and it's also with Moldova in mind. But obviously we support NATO countries. NATO can only be in NATO countries, but we have reinforced the security of that area. And believe you me, it's an important security. we've been doing.
Speaker, in less than a minute.
Just a few words on Moldova. Of course, it is a very important country, well on its European way, and I think the main task is to actually help it to become the full-fledged member of the European Union. It makes a great effort, and of course, well, here speaking in the NATO forum, it's a parallel track, but it's very closely interconnected. Well, when looking back some 20 years ago, well, I am very happy that back then Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia became members of both EU and members of NATO, because else imagine that we would have another gray zone here when we have flourishing democracies sharing the same principles and values with our Euro-Atlantic alliance and community. Same goes for Moldova, which is well underway. And of course, we cannot overlook or forget Belarus, who is under Lukashenko's regime, but which is also a European country that belongs in the future to Europe. So, of course, victory in Ukraine will also mean a change in Belarus, and we have to not forget that.
Senators, rather than ask you to repeat some of these themes, I just want to end by asking you something we really should address, not leave without addressing, which is the subject of Asia and NATO's engagement with Asian partners. I want to ask you both, are you satisfied, content with what you've heard from European partners on their approach to Asia and particularly the challenges posed by China, given the language last year? Or do you think this falls short, given lingering opposition we still have to a Tokyo office, for instance? Senator Tillis.
I think that the outcome of the Madrid conference and the strategic concept and the collective recognition of China's emerging threat was a great start. I think the fact that we have 4 countries here from the Indo-Pacific region is also another indication that the world is small, and that we have to take all of these threats seriously, and we all have I think we're sharing a mutual interest. So I think we made progress last year. I think we're making continuous progress. When you have countries in Indo-Pacific wanting to potentially open offices, I know that may take some time, but start thinking about how that area of responsibility has shared interest with Europe and with the United States is a very good start. And I think it's a good trend, and it will continue to build.
Thank you. Senator Sheen, can you offer us some concluding thoughts on that subject?
Well, I think the threats are connected. So make no mistake, our adversaries, whether it's China, North Korea, Iran, they are watching what happens to Ukraine. They're watching what happens to the transatlantic alliance and whether we can stay together to support our ally. And so we need to recognize that it's all connected and we've got to work together. And that's, I think, what NATO is looking at, not just in terms of the strategic concept that mentioned China, but also in looking at cyber threats, looking at environmental climate threats, all of that, because it's not just the threats that we can see next door, but there are other threats, and NATO is looking at how we can work together to address those.
Thank you so much. We've covered an enormous number of topics, everything from NATO's defence posture to winning the argument with publics, to the extended neighbourhood, Moldova, to the Asia-Pacific region. And all that's left is for me to ask you to please join me in thanking our panellists today.
Welcome to our next afternoon session. My name is Christine Bedsinger, and I'm a Managing Director for Geostrategy North at the German Marshall Fund. We are talking in this session about an issue that is at the core of conversations around the summit and on the top of NATO society minds since February 24th of last year. We have looked at Ukraine's incredible valor, bravery, skills on the battlefield, at home, on social media, and there is admiration across the alliance. There's also a widespread sense that the success and troubles of Ukraine are the success and troubles of the communities across the NATO allies. What is the potential for Ukraine? This is a question we started looking at in the morning's panel on Defending Forward, with Heather Conley mentioning the question of, well, what can Ukraine do for NATO itself? This is a broader question. And how do we unlock the potential for Ukraine once we define it? What are the areas that will be so important here? The military element, the potential for Ukraine to help the rest of NATO in whatever happens next. But also this concept of Ukrainian society, of resilience, of civil society, of the lessons and the incredible practices that Ukraine has developed, and more broadly, the whole of society approach. What could Ukraine be after the war, economically? What is that contribution that Ukraine might play? To tease apart this question, we have an incredible panel for you. Our panel has David Kattler. David is the Assistant Secretary General for Intelligence and Security at NATO. And we have civil society to talk about what it's actually like and the agency that civil society has. Hanna Celeste is the Director of the Security Studies Program at PRISM in Ukraine, and we have Sławomir Debski, who is the Director for the Polish Institute for International Affairs. To get us start a bit on the lay of the land, what is Ukraine, and what is Ukraine in the context of this NATO summit and for NATO allies? We're going to turn to you, David. Can you explain what this has meant? I mean, we all have our personal vision, but in the context of NATO, what is that?
Yeah, look, thanks for the opportunity to come here and speak as part of this great panel, and also to this audience, both here in the room and online. Ukraine has tremendous potential. Ukraine has had tremendous potential and will in the future when the war concludes as well. That I have no doubt. I've been in this post now almost 4 years. I have visited Ukraine at least once a year, every year I've been in this role. I was in Kyiv right before the war, late in 2021, and then also early March of this year. And I can tell you, I have been so proud that Ukraine is a NATO partner, that we have been able to come to Ukraine's aid as a group of allies before this war and certainly during it. And that's why I can say with personal conviction from personal experience that Ukraine really does belong in the NATO family and that Ukraine has this tremendous potential. So I'm going to give sort of two sets of remarks, or at least from two directions. One, a bit about how we see Ukraine as a people, and then a bit about how we see Ukraine as well within the context of the alliance. Look, the Ukrainian resistance has been a crash course in the heroic. Certainly as we watch Ukrainians risk and sometimes lose their lives to defend their country, their homes, their principles, their rights, and their future. President Zelensky has been very much admired for refusing to leave Kyiv as the Russian army pressed on the capital, marched within it. But ordinary people have also demonstrated great courage, defiance, commitment, and determination to remain free and sovereign and independent. The Russian invasion has really rallied Ukraine's vibrant, inclusive civic nation and has strengthened an associated sense of duty and commitment to democracy. People have studied first aid, made Molotov cocktails, joined the resistance, helped neighbors, and even helped strangers. While millions have fled the country, the great majority of Ukrainians remain and participate in that resistance. And polls show that approximately 80% of Ukraine's civilian population, including the refugees all across Europe, are very involved in the war through volunteering, protest action, or giving financial support.
Others are also uniting in support of the reforms that will be required by EU accession. The war seems to have strengthened Ukrainians' commitment to liberalism and also to the inclusive ideas of the Ukrainian nation. This rise of civic national identity in Ukraine, an identity that places civic duty and attachment to the country above all else, is one of the greatest achievements of Ukrainian independence. And I think, frankly, it's one of the most amazing things to see when you look at how the Ukrainian civil society has rallied around the nation over the course of the war. This identity, as I say, has been elevated and nurtured by Zelensky and consolidated by the war as it's proceeded. Ukrainians remind us of who human beings can be, what it looks like to stand on principle, why it's worth fighting, whether or not you believe you can win at any given time, because this fight for Ukraine is existential. It's a gift, really, that Ukrainian civil society has given to the world in this, to remind us of who we can be in facing other crises of our time, who we need to be, what our values are, and which of those we're willing to stand and fight for. Now let me talk about NATO's work with Ukraine. Thanks, but sincerely, I mean, that's a fair appreciation of the situation and how the civil society has stood. NATO's reinforced its support for capability development and capacity building in Ukraine since 2014, and some allies within the alliance even longer than that. We're now working with Ukraine to transition from Soviet-era equipment, doctrines and standards to NATO doctrines and standards to make the Ukrainian armed forces even more interoperable with NATO forces and to help them further reform and modernize their defense and security structures. This will strengthen Ukrainian institutions and help Ukraine move to modern standards. I'd also point out it certainly helps, I think, as well with preparation for EU accession and NATO accession. I'd also highlight that a number of nations appear ready to forge bilateral or multilateral mutual defense pacts with Ukraine, something that no doubt will be discussed in earnest here now during this summit, and are committed to even longer-term plans to build Ukraine's military capabilities. So this will ensure that's a very expensive proposition for Russia to reinvade Ukraine in the future. All NATO allies agree that Ukraine will become a member of the alliance. And as I said in the very beginning, Ukraine's rightful place is in the Euro-Atlantic family, in that NATO family. And even just in December of last year, NATO foreign ministers reaffirmed the Bucharest commitment that was made during the summit in 2008 in that communique, essentially saying that it's not a question of if, it's just a matter of when Ukraine joins the NATO alliance. So you see that that commitment remains and NATO's door remains open. But today, the most important and urgent task still is to ensure that Ukraine prevails as a sovereign, independent, democratic nation in Europe. And that's exactly what the NATO alliance and all of its members, and even more nations outside the alliance through the Ramstein format, are committed to doing, mobilizing as much as nations can when it comes to military, economic, financial, and humanitarian support. And allies have made clear at the Defense Contact Group meetings this year that they need to and will sustain the support for the long haul. So hopefully I've given you an idea of how we see Ukraine as Ukraine and what we see now of the ongoing discussion about where we will take commitments during the summit. So thanks again.
Thank you. Hanna, from your perspective, what does Ukraine need to unlock its potential? You've heard David's view and NATO's assessment. What is needed and what is that potential?
Ukraine don't need its potential to be unlocked. Ukraine needs its potential not to be locked. And that is one of the most serious issues. And here the question is that to lock this potential, we have two reasons. One is Russian aggression, because de facto their actions are locking potential in terms of the development, from the simple things as blocking of the Black Sea ports, so blocking our economic activities and maritime security, to blocking developing of the countries, both military, civilian, in all spheres that is possible. But another thing, unfortunately, and I don't want definitely to put the equal between these, but not inviting Ukraine or not making statements that are very clear, not the open door policy, but something more clear, less obscure about Ukrainian membership, that's also locking. That's what locked us in Bucharest in 2008, de facto locked that potential. And we should be aware of this, because that's so nice to hear since the morning, but if to be honest, the whole year, all this, we are supporting you, but sometimes you feel like it is the whole stadium that is watching the football game. We are supporting you, but this stadium will never play in that football team. Or as watching the big blockbuster Hollywood movie, when you're finally starting your counter-offense, and everybody is asking the questions. I really would like this we that I heard so many times, even the previous session, to become a real we. We in terms of understanding the responsibility of the potential and understanding that we are speaking about our joint potential, how the European security can be unlocked and guaranteed in case it is together, Ukraine and NATO, how Ukraine inside of NATO can help with the NATO capabilities and capacities, but definitely for what we are so many years talking is how NATO can help Ukraine. Because here we definitely understand that there have been a lot of reforms done from 2014, even not speaking about earlier reforms that help a lot, but from 2014 till 2022, we didn't spoke that much about this, but there were a lot of small things done that helped at the very first months of the war. That's why, for me, that was so pity to hear the communications from the NATO side in spring last year, each time what we cannot do. I mean, as a NATO, we cannot do this. And I was shocked, like, why do you diminish your role as you already did? You helped with command control, you had with logistics, you had with cyber. That's what allowed the Ukrainian armed forces to fight absolutely different compared to the Russian forces. The Western support now in terms of ammunition, of everything, that is what is helping. That's why when we speak about the potential, I would like to speak about the amplification, about the joint potential, about these joint perspectives. Otherwise, it is still will be you and us, but not some, and everybody is discussing Ukraine as something of the nice doll, how to make it better, but not speaking about the real actions that we can make. And then the potential can be huge. Everybody is speaking about the Ukrainian knowledge of the combat, how to fight Russia. Everybody is speaking about Ukrainian cyber. Everybody is speaking about Ukrainian development industries for now, aviation, Salis program that we used to have together. We're speaking about the agriculture in Ukraine, but we are not speaking about other spheres that are in the priority of the NATO strategic concept. The Ukrainian experience in resilience from what you started, and we can speak about this, the joint things that we can do in climate change, for example, in maritime security, in many other spheres. So it seems to me that it's definitely the main problem from what I started, is not unlocking, but not to lock our minds, first of all, about what we can do if we speak really about we.
And Hannah, quick follow-up, and you're talking a lot about the speaking and the words, but there are actions as well. There's so much civil society cooperation there. You're saying NATO has done, well, NATO allies have done so much on the ground in order to make the Ukrainian army as it is today. Do you see a difference between the way we speak about Ukraine and what we do with Ukraine, or is there a problem on both?
You know, the question is that sometimes our fears limit our actions, and a lot of the fears are very, how to say it, they're irrational. We made in Ukrainian Prism a big research about the main fears in the NATO countries about inviting Ukraine, and some of them were about the real things, but some were really weird. Like, for example, if Ukraine joined NATO, Ukraine will be hating Russia that much that it will push NATO to the war with Russia, or some other stuff about this. That's why these actions and words sometimes go in parallel. You know, you can have the same personality, the same politician that one day is really understanding what should be done, signing the decrees how to give the support to Ukraine, millions of dollars, this ammunition, and then suddenly is becoming afraid of his or her own actions, because I don't want to blame one country, we saw it in many partner countries, as being afraid what they did, and the statements are coming that, oh, no, that probably was too much, or no, we can give you HIMARS, but we cannot give it for 100 kilometers, the rockets that it. So, and that's why it's sometimes very difficult to say what is the biggest problem for our partners, to act or even to start naming the things, what they are, and through these changes of the rhetoric to come to the changes of actions. Because sometimes the decisions are made quicker for actions than the months we experience before the wording is changing. As very simple example, you said about the actions of something. Everybody is supporting Ukraine military. We have Rammstein, everything. How many politicians in your countries use the word Russian aggression or Russian invasion instead of Ukrainian conflict? Or better to say, how many times per day you hear Ukrainian war and Ukrainian conflict? That is wording that really matter because it influences the action. Because when you don't name Russia, you exclude Russia. It's like Russia is not guilty. And Ukrainian war, Ukrainian conflict, for me, it means that something is happening just in Ukraine. And nobody is guilty, or Ukrainians is guilty. That it is, and that is also will come for the potential in this way, because in this way we're speaking about locking or unlocking, looking only inside of Ukraine. What Ukrainians can do, what civil society, what these can do, and not looking what demands we have towards Russia, for example. That's all these peace initiatives from African countries, from China, where Russia is excluded. Ukraine needs to stop the war. Okay, we are ready. What about Russia? Should Russia stop the war or not? But when you read, and okay, I can understand when it is somebody from the countries that are not Ukrainian allies, but when I hear the same statements from the NATO member states, I'm becoming a little bit confused and can't understand that. So why do you provide us with the weapons if it is only us who is guilty that the war is not over yet?
Yes, it is a very interesting conundrum there, with words and actions not necessarily being on the same page. But there's so much agency, right? So I think Ukraine's agency has been the excellent example, agency in every way. How is that received, Sławomir, in Poland, in civil society, across NATO allies? What is Ukraine's potential? What has Ukraine brought to the table, and what can it bring to the table in the future?
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm coming from the country which doesn't have a problem with vocabulary. If we are talking about Russian aggression on Ukraine. I think it's, with the time, every organization adopts a kind of the thinking which actually leads to focusing on itself. So existing organization explains its very existence. So, and I think that with NATO in such context, during the summit, we tend to fall into this trap. So let me start from reminding all of us the famous words of first Secretary of General of NATO, Lord Ismay, when he was asked what NATO is for, and it was at the time when NATO was created. So he said to the European public that NATO is for peace. NATO is for peace by common collective defense. So now we can ask ourselves, what about Ukraine? And I think we all can easily agree that Ukraine is also for peace. Ukraine is fighting for peace. So NATO and Ukraine are already allies in defending peace in Europe. Peace which is challenged by Russian aggression, peace and international system which is challenged by Russian aggression. Ukraine defends what NATO is for. The Ukraine defends international law, including United Nations Charter. Ukraine proves that every nation has a right for self-defense, and Ukraine proves that every nation has the right to call the allies and call the other members of United Nations Charter for assistance if it's attacked. So here we are. I mean, we are creating a community interested in defending peace in Europe. Now we can go a step further. What is required to re-establish peace in Europe, because Russia brought war to the European continent, brought instability, to European societies and uncertainty. So if we are talking about unlocking potential, it's not only about unlocking Ukraine's potential, it's about unlocking Europe's potential, or even transatlantic potential. And here we can cooperate. What I believe is absolutely required to unlock transatlantic potential, to re-establish peace in Europe, is defeating Russia. Russia defined its war aims against Ukraine as an existential identity thing. Putin said, and he confirmed it publicly a number of times, that the very existence of Ukraine is challenging Russia, is undermining Russia's identity, that Russia without Ukraine cannot exist. So, if Putin defined this war in such terms, the only solution, the only response we can give is to deny Russia this war aim. I mean, we have to do all we can to prove to Putin and his acolytes and his cronies that Ukraine can exist, can flourish, can develop, and can be part of every organization it wants to become a member. And coming back to this unlocking potential, I would like to see the message coming from this Vilnius summit to Russia and to the outside world, outside of NATO and Ukraine, that this war is about the future of Europe, that Ukraine's victory would unlock potential of Europe, would unlock potential of transatlantic relations, and would bring peace to all Europeans. Thank you.
So, unsurprisingly, at the NATO summit, we have a very militarily focused approach. But are there other who's in terms of who can unlock or who can prevent the locking of that we're not talking to properly? The tremendous, I think, surprise in many ways was the depth of commitment for Ukraine's cause across societies. And this is really what is fueling the fact that there are defense support mechanisms. So we have that. How do we keep that going? How do we get more civil society on? Who else needs to be in the picture, or who do we need to add or not lose? And is there someone we're not talking to enough about this? Global South, Hannah, you talked about there are countries that don't necessarily agree. Is there someone in our own societies that doesn't get it, that we should be talking to more? So.
I would probably start, we have several groups that, let's say, we still haven't engaged sufficiently. First of all, for example, for me, it was a shock that environmental groups are totally out of the conversation about this war. I haven't seen any strong statement from any of the big environment protection organizations. Even Greta Thunberg managed to tweet something several days after the Kakhovka Dam destruction. The Kakhovka Dam destruction made our tremendous, it's not just a tragedy for the people's lives of those, but that is just consequences that we will have for the food security, for the environment, for the Black Sea, for everything. That is, in terms of environment, a catastrophe close to the nuclear explosion by the years of consequences we will have. None of the organizations made statements. Then you have plenty of organizations that are in charge of children's rights around the globe. Few of them made statements about thousands and thousands of kidnapped Ukrainian kids that are currently in the Russian Federation, and none of them helping de facto of returning them back. Sometimes it is still the problem with the human rights organizations that are becoming aware of the not those issues that they really need to look on the ground what is happening. They're just like blind, they're ignoring. They would like to speak about cluster ammunition, but they don't want to speak that Russia been using this cluster ammunition for 9 years against Ukrainian cities. But they suddenly woke up a week ago when the United States said that they will give this cluster ammunition to us. For me, that is the examples that we were not talking enough probably with these groups. We were speaking with the politicians, we were speaking with political science or military experts, but not with these groups. Then it is still the question for me sometimes for the feminist groups. And here quite an interesting thing, because a lot in the those of the I would say radical feminist camp, because I cannot put it to all of them, that thinks that supplying of weapons should be prohibited for Ukraine. And we have these groups that are working because that is in general of these pacifistic, and in general the pacifistic movements, they just would like the war to be over. And they don't explain how this war should be over. The war should be over. And most of them decided in the logic of these statements that the war should be over only by not supplying weapons to Ukraine. Not by Russian forces getting out of the Ukrainian territories, but of not supplying weapons to Ukraine. So that's also give me a certain signals that we made something wrong, probably not reaching them with the proper arguments, or just not reaching them. Or they are so ignorant if they can't understand what is there. And then the big group, that is the so-called Global South. I don't like this wording. And even in the Global South, we have definitely a lot of countries that are supporting Ukraine. We have Japan changing their military doctrine to support Ukraine. But we still have problems of communications there. And for example, most of the African countries are blaming Ukraine in food security issues and food crisis, not Russia. They are thinking that it is us, because we are continuing fighting, we have this problem. I haven't heard any statements for Russians targeting the ports. This night, Odessa region was targeted, and one of the Shaheeds made a fire at the grain terminal in the port. The port that is included in the grain deal. So they openly violated the grain deal that they signed. Any statement from the African leaders who just traveled a few weeks ago to Ukraine, pushing us for the peace or appeasement with Moscow? So that is the question still of, is it just Ukraine that is not speaking? Or that is probably all of us inside of Europe that we spoke with ourselves, and there are other groups that maybe we need to find the wording that are good for them, as coming and speaking about the rule-based order. If they are not ready to speak about liberal order or something like this, but at least to speak in this way about the rules-based order that is currently totally violated.
So some to-dos, both for ourselves, but across our societies and abroad. David, you wanted to come in on this.
Yeah, look, I'll just pick up a couple points.
Yeah.
I think it's important that we have dialogue with more groups that have, I mean, if you take the British term, that are pressure groups that have various interests that are relevant, to the situation. But we're kind of talking to ourselves when we have that discussion. And I feel it more here in this role. Certainly, I felt it in Washington. We talk about the Beltway effect, where we kind of talk to ourselves in this national security process with think tanks. You go to various events. And it's important, but it's not as important as it is for our leaders to speak with our societies and for our societies to understand what's happening and why it's important. So, I mean, Greta Thunberg's interesting to me, but not as much as my president speaking to the American people to explain why it is so important, why it is in the United States' national interest to support Ukraine directly through NATO, etc. That's what's most important. There will be no return to a February 22nd security environment. It's just not going to happen. This is a real war. It's not a crisis that we can just turn our eyes away from and think it's going to disappear. Our societies are also paying a price. It certainly pales in comparison to the price that the Ukrainian society pays. But it is a price nonetheless that's being paid by many nations around the world. And I think fundamentally, the thing that I find most convincing when I speak to a public audience, a purely public audience, not an audience that's of the think tank world or fellow people involved in national security processes, they understand what matters here. It's an illegal war that is completely unjust. They see the violence, the murder, the rape, the torture, the theft, the kidnapping, the forced deportation, and they are right to be deeply shocked and offended
by that. And they understand at a human level how deeply wrong that is. And I think that's a core part of the reason why so many societies provide the strong support that they do. We see it in polling, but what I'm trying to emphasize to you is that there's a human factor here at the civil society level that leaders are wise to appreciate and understand. And in some cases, that civil society impetus to wish to respond and assist has actually led the political decision-making and inspired the political decision-making in certain directions.
It is very inspiring. Slavomir.
There is a quite interesting aspect of relationship between decision makers, NATO, and general public, civil society, if you want, in which you can now realize here in Vilnius. NATO is and has always been seen as a American alliance. I mean, the very first alliance in which United States committed itself to defend peace in Europe. So that's, Congress is on board, President is on board, U.S. armed forces and military potential is on board. So naturally, President of United States was seen as a leader of the free world on every summit, except this one. Here in Vilnius, we have President Zelensky, who is seen now as a leader of the free world. He's coming here as a representative of the country aspiring to become a member of NATO and influencing the agenda of the alliance. And President Zelensky is, we have to give him the credit. He's doing his public policy, public diplomacy in an excellent way. Now there is a conversation, not far from here, about communique, about invitations, about the wording, how we can embrace Ukraine, how we can meet Ukrainians' expectations to become a member of NATO in future. And what President Zelensky is doing, he's unable to negotiate the text because it's up to the members to decide what kind of the message we'll send to Ukraine. But he tries to bring on board to address the public behind the leaders. Because public wants wants NATO to help Ukraine. So that's the way how, that's yet another proof that we are here for common cause. Ukraine and NATO. And we need to find the ways to collectively restore peace in Europe. That's our main goal. That should be our main goal for both the leaders of the alliance and Ukraine. And we will find a way. I'm 100% convinced that we will find a way to restore peace in Europe.
Yes. We have questions on the hows and the whats, but if there's a question in the audience as well, if we have, it's a bit hard to see in the glare. Okay, so we have one question there. As you line up, I'll ask from here. Will there be timely security guarantees for Ukraine is coming through the Slido system? Sitting here, David, do you think that there will be meat for Ukraine?
There is always meat at a summit. This is my fourth summit. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that I can't presuppose what any of the outcomes will be. But this certainly is in discussion.
Yes, question from the floor.
Thank you. Benjamin Tallis, German Council on Foreign Relations. David, you alluded to some of this in your talk, but I think the key here is to not understand that we're just unlocking Ukraine's potential, but that Ukraine has shown us how to unlock our own potential. This is about reviving and renewing the liberal democratic world as well as defending it and spreading it. And I'd be interested to hear from the panel, what do you think is our homework in democratic societies in the West to make good on that and to actually realize that potential, not only for Ukraine as the frontier state of our better future, but for all of us in actually creating a better future for our populations to ensure that democracies can deliver materially as well as morally on their promise to be a superior system? Thank you.
I think each of that could be an essay in response, but if you could have 2 points on that answer, maybe starting with Slavomir, what are the 2 points that get to that?
I think we need to do all possible to help Ukraine to win this war, repel Russian aggression. So that's absolutely fundamental, I think, and we can do that. We can do that. It's up to us to make the decision. And second, we have to send the message not only to Russia, but all adversaries, all those who are toying with the idea that aggression on neighbors can be a good way of doing business in contemporary world. We have to send this message together that no, you are not going to succeed, you are not going to prosper, and your attempts and your country will be defeated.
I think we could borrow some of Ukraine's excellent digital media experts to figure out how to land those messages with memes, because that has been impressive. What is your homework for the others? And 2 quick points.
You know, 2 things first. That is definitely to remember that values should be protected, and explanation to your societies that sometimes they needed to be not only protected but also defended, because unfortunately in Europe we used to think that human rights, the values of democracy and everything, that's something that we already had, and they're inevitable. They can be reversed, both politically with the populists or some political parties, or military with the actions of adversaries. So a little bit refreshing ourselves, waking up and explaining, yeah, the threat still can be. And the second, to stop being afraid of their own potential. It seems to me that during this year we saw more self-restrictions inside of the European political circles, inside of the European societies, than the actual threats were from the Russian Federation. And that's something like, that definitely only psychologically we can change. Finally, to understand that you have the deterrence potential, you have a stronger armed forces than the Russian Federation, you have the nuclear weapons. That's why I never could understand, for example, why French being afraid of the Putin statements about use of the nuclear. Come on, you had the nuclear for 60 years. You should have all the deterrence plans. Why you were not afraid 20 years ago, why you started to be now. So just stop to be afraid of their own potential.
David, your 2 points.
Okay, very briefly, I think first, Ukraine must prevail. Ukraine must win. It matters not just for Ukraine, but it matters for the security architecture in Europe and the security architecture that NATO cares the most about. So it's important. Really important to see that all the way through. And I think the related point I would make is that while I don't think anyone knows when the war will end, I think everyone can easily understand that the way the war ends matters a great deal. That if there is an unjust peace that does not ensure that Ukraine is free and whole, I don't know how long that peace lasts. And that's why I think it's so important that we have to be very, very clear with ourselves and with our nations about what this means and why we do the things that we do to support Ukraine.
There are any additional questions from the floor? Yes, right there.
Hi, Susan Markham from the Halifax International Security Forum. I think we can all agree that no country can reach its full potential unless all citizens are involved. So I was just wondering how NATO and civil society in Ukraine is working to engage women leaders and integrating the issue of gender equality into the war and rebuilding efforts.
We just had this morning first wonderful meeting with the NATO WPS talking about how to incorporate as much as possible. There are several issues. First, Ukraine is definitely up to the 1325 and have the national plan just adopted. We see more women in the military and security services, and the last year increased the numbers dramatically. So the bigger numbers will lead to the changes to of some of the policies as well. That is a natural process because it is pushing already from the ground. You have, because men cannot travel, more and more women who became the advocates and the lobbyists of Ukraine abroad. So you also, those women who before probably were not sure can they be a good speaker or not, they started traveling because they understand that that is the only chance and that is a necessity. So a lot of these grassroots initiatives, they are leading also to the political levels. I cannot say that it is are all rose and nice. No, unfortunately, we hear the statements from some of the top politicians about reconstruction. I have two deputies that are female. Why you think that we have problems with females? So that just demonstrates the misunderstanding of some of these. But we initiate these discussions. We're putting these, we have the advisors at each of them, from military groups and sections to the ministries, that are now raising these questions. And through raising proper questions, we expect to have better changes in the policies as well.
I think that's a wonderful note to end on. And I think what is clear is that we have so many tasks to either not lock or to unlock Ukraine's potential militarily. The need to ensure victory is paramount, and to have this future with NATO that there is so much commitment to. But that requires also the societies to be fully on board. And clearly there are parts of society that could use a lot more engagement on this as we move forward. So on hopeful notes, and with our homework cut out for us, I'm happy to turn you over to the next session. Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Congratulations for those who are still here. I think that I'm sure that it's a big effort to stay alive and still being able to ask the questions and participate in the discussion. I will be your moderator for the next panel, which is called The Nexus of Stability and Deterrence, Reducing Risks in the Nuclear Age. Just a couple of days ago, our neighbor, Alexander Lukashenko, during his conversation with Steve Rosenberg, mused, "God forbid if I have to take a decision to use nuclear weapons." And then he added, "Nuclear weapons are just the weapons." This situation, as many other situations during the recent year, are making us to reflect on the stability of our security and pose some questions related to validity of nuclear taboo, related to nuclear proliferation, and also functioning of the arms control regimes. What is the impact of the war in Ukraine on the nuclear stability? And what role NATO has to play in the situation? Does it have any role to play in the situation? So these are the questions which will be discussed in this panel, and probably some more. And we have the most knowledgeable and diverse panel to answer these questions and to reflect upon these questions. So first of all, let me introduce to you Mr. Angus Lapsley, who is Assistant Secretary General for Defense Policy and Planning from NATO. Nicholas Tenzer, I hope I pronounced it in the right way, and he is Senior Fellow at CEPA, Center of European Policy Analysis. And last but not least, Julia Berghofer, who is a Senior Policy Fellow at the European Leadership Network. So without further ado, I'd like to turn to my wonderful panelists and to pose the first question. And my first question goes to Angus. So what is your take? What is the impact of war in Ukraine and Putin's constant saber-rattling on the nuclear taboo? Is it being weakened or strengthened?
Well, thank you, Margarita, and good afternoon, everyone. So I'm pretty certain that actually the nuclear taboo is as strong today as it's ever been. I also think deterrence works as well today as it has ever done. There is a reason why Russia has not attacked NATO at any point in this war, and there's a reason why NATO is very clear that it doesn't itself want to get into a conflict with Russia. But I think what we have seen is that Russia has tried to intimidate not just NATO, but Ukraine itself and the international community more broadly. You could argue they've tried to coerce us with the threat of nuclear use, and I would argue it hasn't really worked. And one of the reasons it hasn't really worked is that taboo is still so strong. It's deeply irresponsible even to threaten the use of nuclear weapons or to make all sorts of wild claims about changing your posture. And I think what Russia is now doing, making such a public show of saying it's going to move nuclear weapons into Belarus, I think that is part of that intimidation and coercion. But I would argue it's not working. And using nuclear weapons would still be a huge step that I think Russia wouldn't take lightly. And I think we understand that, they understand it, and that's why that coercion is not working the way that perhaps they intend.
But should NATO just disregard those threats, or should we rethink our nuclear posture, reacting to what's happening on the ground, probably not only in Europe, but further away? So what NATO should do in this situation?
So look, nuclear is one of those areas where you should never be complacent and you should take everything seriously, and we do. Because even if the likelihood of an event is low, the impact would be horrific. So we do take this really seriously, and NATO has spent a lot of time over the last 18 months, and indeed going back further than that, reflecting on our own nuclear posture and making sure that it is predictable, stable, but also credible. And that means exercising, it means demonstrating our capability, it means the kind of investments that lots of allies are making at the moment, whether that's the US and France and the UK, all putting considerable investment in the moment into modernizing their nuclear forces so that they are credible for the future. But also, allies who participate in the nuclear sharing arrangements in NATO, like Germany and others, who are investing heavily in the capabilities they need for that mission to be credible well into the 21st century. So I think being credible on our own deterrence, communicating that, so that any potential adversary knows that it's there, it's unchanging, and it's serious. I think that is ultimately the best way of reducing the risks.
You've touched upon the issue of nuclear sharing. Do you think that it could be expanded, or NATO-Russia Founding Act is still limiting us?
Well, look, our nuclear sharing arrangements go back to the 1960s, and they have been very stable throughout that period. Now, we keep posture under review all the time. There are also lots of different ways in which allies can contribute to our nuclear sharing arrangements. It's not just allies that have nuclear weapons, American nuclear weapons stationed in their country. It's also the contribution you can make, for example, to the wider air mission, to suppression of enemy air defenses. There are all sorts of important roles, and that's exactly what we keep under review. And we will always be driven by the threat and what is the best, most credible military way to respond to that threat. That's what's driving us.
But you didn't answer my question regarding NATO-Russia Founding Act. Is it still limiting us? Because when it comes to nuclear, everyone brings it to the table. We don't believe that it's functioning because Russia has breached it on numerous times. But when the nuclear issue is being raised, it's brought back to the table.
Yeah.
So is it still functioning?
We've been very clear that we will take the sovereign decisions as an alliance that we need to take to maintain our deterrence and our defense. That's what we'll do. That isn't constrained.
Thank you. And I'll turn to Nicola, and I'll ask the similar question, but a bit in a different way, from a different angle. Back to Putin's nuclear saber rattling. Does it make impression in national capitals? How does it impact our decision making? For instance, with respect to the military aid for Ukraine, or potentially also giving the membership to Ukraine. So does it have an impact on our national decision makers?
Absolutely. I think I fully agree with, I will say, the sense of your questions, because if we look back to the last 2 decades, or more precisely the last 22 years, in fact, I will say that the Russian blackmail worked. And it allows Putin, in fact, to win all its wars. In Georgia, before in Chechnya, of course, in Syria, in a way, of course, in Ukraine during the period at least 2014-2022. And in fact, you had always, I mean, this fear coming from the West that this threat was credible. And I think that as a response to the threat, the world leaders were not able to say, well, we are not a threat. And in fact, still now, in fact, we are not giving Ukraine all the weapons it needs. Basically, in my view, because of this threat. And I just welcome, I mean, my President Emmanuel Macron's decision today to provide Ukraine with Scalp long-range missiles. And I hope that it will have some effects also on Washington, D.C. But having said that, I still consider that we are too much buying the alleged red lines put by Russia on this because of basically these threats. And always, for instance, I was advocating since the first day of the war, February 24th, 2022, the fact that we should take actions according to the Article 51 of the UN Charter. Because not only we know Ukraine could retaliate to the attack, but we in the West, we are legitimate to help Ukraine just to counter the threats and the attack. We didn't. And in my view, you have this kind of nuclear blackmail still functioning right now, of course. And I fully agree with what everything Angus said just at the moment. We have to take, I mean, any kind of nuclear threats seriously. It means that we have to monitor. We must have very clear intelligence assessment on what Russia and other nuclear power are doing. Certainly we must absolutely do that. And we have also to be very clear and to assess, I know how difficult it is, the chain of command in Russia. We know that we are 3 persons that are needed to push on the button: Putin, Shoigu, the Minister of Defense, and Gerasimov, the Chief of Staff of the Army. And there will be other people, certainly, who will be very needed to take concretely action. So we have to assess everything. But the idea is that there are still red lines, and there are some things that we cannot do, is completely, in my view, a blunder. Let me adjust a thing. If we had taken actions more decisively at the beginning of the war, not only we would have saved thousands, I would say dozens of thousands of lives, of Ukrainian lives. But certainly we could have basically prevented at the earliest possible stage any kind of risk of war. And the more, we are hesitating, I will say the more, even if, in my view, at very, very, very low level, the risk is increasing.
Thank you. And I'm just wondering, okay, in academia, at the decision-making level, it is clear your recipe is to monitor but not to overreact. But how to calm down the societies? Because they see those terrible headlines and they react, and politicians have to react to their reaction. So that is the first question. And the second one, which is related, why nuclear saber rattling is more effective in the Western societies, in the countries which are further away from Russia, than in the countries which can feel immediate threat from Russia. Why is this happening?
I think that I will, if you allow me, just to answer your second points before. First of all, we must not underestimate the depths of the Russian propaganda in the Western societies. I remember, in many TV shows, not only in my country, in France, but also, in the UK, in Germany, in some other country, in the US as well, you had, hidden Russian propagandists saying, well, we must not deliver weapons to Ukraine because otherwise Russia will nuke them and us. And you had those propagandists saying, okay, we want to save Ukrainian lives, but because of that, we don't have to send weapons to them, because of the nuclear threats. So, we must not underestimate this hidden propaganda. And then, of course, it had effects on the average people. And because the average people, of course, could fear, and that's a legitimate fear, the use of nuclear weapons that must remain something absolutely unacceptable. I think that we certainly, were, I will say, insufficiently dealt with this kind of issue, just to offer the counter-arguments to those propagandists coming not only, I would say, from the government and the senior officials, but also for the media who studied very clearly, this kind of issue. And then on your first questions, first of all, I think we have to send the right signal. First of all, if we have, and we had some, world democratic leaders saying, well, there is a true risk, that's the best, very bad message to the public opinion. Second, and we did so, we must make very clear that we have sent some messages to Russia. Third thing, we must not accredit the idea of a kind of World War III, because immediately, and that's part of the Russian propaganda, use of nuclear weapons means, of course, the annihilation of the Earth and World War III. No, it's not the case, because for a very one reason that, all the specialists perfectly know, we can answer to nuclear threats through conventional means. And I think that there was the idea, especially because we in Europe also haven't devoted enough means to the reinforcements or conventional army, that, it was only the questions of, rivalry between the great powers was only a question of nuclear threats. And the fact is not. The fact is that was fully predictable. No, we have a conventional war waged by Russia in Europe, and we are able to answer conventionally. And even if there is a nuclear threat, we can also answer conventionally. And I think that's a very important message, also to reassure the public opinion.
So, potential of answering nuclear threats with conventional weapons is key also in reassuring the society.
Absolutely.
And my last question takes me a bit further away from Ukraine, but what's happening in Ukraine is used as a test ground or as a simulation for countries which are a bit further away. And what we do there, how we as collective West react and what's happening in Ukraine is considered and taken as a certain, lessons learned by those countries in their projection of how to behave, what to do themselves. And I mean China. China is looking very precisely at what's happening in Ukraine, conventionally, how we are reacting to what's happening in Ukraine, but also in terms of our nuclear messaging and our nuclear posture. And my question is, Lithuania just 2 weeks ago has adopted Indo-Pacific strategy. Does NATO have to have something similar, to have an Indo-Pacific strategy, also including a very clear stance, nuclear posture vis-à-vis China?
Absolutely, and I think that first of all, I think what we are doing in Ukraine is certainly a message that we send to people of the Republic of China, obviously. And the fact is that if we let, a nuclear power, namely Russia, deter us and limit, and I will also self-deter ourselves and limit our willingness to take action in Ukraine, it will be certainly the wrong signal sent to Beijing. That's absolutely true. And I think that, of course, Beijing is watching that very carefully, because if you are a nuclear power and you say, oh, okay, you can dictate your conditions to the planet, to everyone, you can invade the neighboring country, they can shatter, the world order, then, there will be absolutely no peace. And that's true for China, but that could be also true for some minor nuclear powers. In regional conflicts especially, and we have many other examples. Then the second thing is the real issue. Some analysts are still talking about red lines. I said before that we don't have to buy, the red lines from China, and from Russia, for both countries, in fact. But I think we have also to be credible on all red lines. And then two issues. First of all, we have, the worst examples, during the last decade was the examples of Obama's so-called red lines, in Syria in 2013, that were never enforced after the chemical attack on the Ghouta. And I think that everything that comes after that, in Syria, where the war is still ongoing, and Russia is still shelling the civilians there, and of course in Ukraine, also is coming from, the lack of credibility. And I remember had that period of time of just 1 year after trips to Japan and South Korea and discussed with senior officials, and they said, well, what's about the credibility? And that was the questions. And the second point is that, well, we are talking about nuclear threats, but the nuclear threat coming from Russia is exactly the same towards NATO country that it is towards Ukraine. So that makes the difference. And I think that if we want to be credible, that's my argument in 1.5 years, if you want to be credible, in our deterrence for NATO country, we must be also credible in facing the war waged by Russia against Ukraine.
Thank you. Julia, I'd like to ask a bit different question. Although nuclear disasters happening in nuclear power plants usually are put in the same basket as the nuclear warfare, and the risks are evaluated pretty much on the same level, but it's a sort of a different problem. So my question is, what is your take, what is your assessment on the potential of the nuclear disaster in Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, how we should reduce these risks, and is there any role for NATO in the scenario?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to mention that I don't see a particular NATO responsibility for solving the issue, because the main responsibility lies with Russia, and Moscow has deliberately created that situation around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, and it's continuing to do so. that doesn't mean that there is no role for NATO or NATO member states at all. But maybe let me start by saying something about different risks, nuclear-related risks, because as you correctly said, these types of risks, different types of risks related to nuclear weapons or nuclear radiation are very often, or military risks are very often mixed together. And that creates something like, it contributes to Russian efforts of creating this fog of war. So first of all, we have military risks. So risks in the conventional field, for example, hazardous military encounters, for example, in the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea, especially in congested areas, smaller areas. You could say now with NATO enlargement, the Baltic Sea becomes a NATO lake. So you can see when tensions are on the rise, especially between nuclear weapon states or between a nuclear weapon state and countries that are members of a nuclear alliance, you have a greater risk for escalation. And that could always, in the worst case, go to a nuclear area, also even if the risk is rather low. And then you have risks typically related to nuclear weapons that are risks related to doctrinal use, to escalatory use. And for both of these baskets, so you can put both of these risks into different baskets, and you have risk reduction measures that you can apply in both areas. So for example, managing dangerous encounters over the high seas or between military aircraft and military vessels, or even between civilian aircraft and military aircraft, something like this. And in the nuclear field, nuclear weapons field, you can apply risk reduction measures like talking about doctrines, trying to decrease ambiguity, creating more transparency. There are different types of approaches, and it's important to say that NATO itself is not doing any agreements. So NATO is a platform for discussing risk reduction and arms control. NATO is not signing any arms control agreements or risk reduction agreements. And now, that was a bit of an introduction. Now I come to the situation around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, because that's quite different. It's not related to nuclear weapons, although in the public perceptions, it's almost mixed together. Risks around nuclear power plants and potential incidents are very, very different from the use of a strategic or tactical nuclear weapon. And what we see there is more related to these threat scenarios around CBRN issues, around issues related to chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear issues. So that's a whole different basket. And right now we see that the IAEA is doing a great job in being there on the ground, having a mission there. And what they are doing is mostly observing the situation and doing myth busting, because that's quite important to inform the public, to inform decision makers what's going on there. And quite often that differs a lot from public perception. And what I think is important also in a NATO context to consider is that I think the situation around Zaporizhzhia is something that you can put into the basket of hybrid threats rather than classical nuclear threats, because it plays into that game of creating disinformation, of creating a dangerous situation over a long period of time while pursuing other activities in parallel. It's also about influencing the public. You've raised the issue of public perception. So when we think back to Fukushima in 2011, that had a huge impact on public perception about nuclear power plants. So this is, for the Russian side, a very good issue of just trying to influence public perception. So I think the least thing that NATO could do would consider these kinds of threats as part of the broader Russian hybrid strategy and not consider this as an isolated event, but rather as something that it could inform our risk assessments in the future.
But are there any measures that we can take to prevent situations like that? I'm just pondering upon one situation. There was in the recent news a message that Wagner troops have been approaching one of the nuclear plants in Russia, and also Russian armed forces are, well, mining the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. So it's definitely not the matter for International Atomic Agency, but do we have any measures to prevent that?
Well, unfortunately, you don't have something like the creation of a security zone around nuclear power plants. Ideally, you would have that on a global scale. Like something like a norm or an agreement that you must not interfere with nuclear power plants when there is a conflict or crisis whatsoever. Unfortunately, something like this doesn't exist, even not on a unilateral level. For example, states could unilaterally declare that they will not attack nuclear power plants whatsoever. Unfortunately, something like this doesn't exist. It's a bit like, I would compare that dilemma with the cybersphere, where it would be great to have norms, especially norms that you could apply to critical infrastructure, but you don't have them. And I don't want to be overly pessimistic, but realistically, I don't see that happening, because it's just going back to the Russian side and to Zaporizhzhia, it's just a very practical issue to create a threat scenario without actually doing something. Like it's still under the level of military activity. Well, apart from the shelling that has happened, especially and is still ongoing, but on the basis, it's below the level of military activity. So it's a very practical tool. And then the question is, why should you subscribe to such a norm if it serves your interests and if you don't have like an immediate motivation to just not do that?
I think that in general, and in particular in the nuclear field, we are facing this dilemma. Norms and agreements are usually the ones who are creating trust, reducing uncertainty, ensuring stability. But at the moment, there is no appetite for arms control because we have to deter. So what is the future of the arms control in nuclear fields? What's your take? I know it's a very difficult and broad question. But.
Well, it's a question that many people are asking right now, and rightly so, because a common saying is you don't do arms control with your friends, and maybe you don't do risk reduction with your friends, but you do that in a crisis. And when we look back at the Cold War, we can see that the initial impulse to do risk reduction and arms control started after the Cuban Missile Crisis, because the actors just realized we don't do arms control because we want to please others, but we want to be safe ourselves. The problem right now is arms control treaties, as we all know, have eroded. We don't have that basis anymore, so we have to go back to the very basics, and the basics are risk reduction. So how can we avoid nuclear war? And that is a very technical question for the Western part and for the NATO side. For Russia and China, it's a very political question. So they want issues like Ukraine to be solved, like for Russia, to be solved before they enter into a conversation about risk reduction measures. Something I mentioned that in the beginning about transparency, understanding each other's doctrine, trying to make a bit clearer what are the scenarios of nuclear use on each of the sides, something like this. But it's hard to start a conversation with the other side if the other side doesn't want to do that. So quite recently, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan just re-emphasized that you could, in fact, discuss about risk reduction issues as a matter of compartmentalization. So you keep that separate from the overall situation. And that was put on the table, and those of you who read the statement by Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov know that this was kind of politicized by the Russian side. So, in fact, compartmentalization is not something that the US invented or NATO invented, but something that served the interests of both sides during the Cold War, and right now it's being politicized and framed as something that serves US interests. But maybe to give it a slightly, well, I wouldn't say optimistic turn, but something that NATO can do is looking at all the matters that might be applicable once the hot phase or the fighting in Ukraine is over, something that could be done in the future, especially on the very technical level of risk reduction. And also maybe one thing, if I may add that, it's also very important to consider how all the activities that the West is pursuing with regards to nuclear weapons, with regards to Russia, are informing or maybe even shaping Chinese behavior in the future. So, as you said, China is looking very carefully what's happening in Ukraine, and how we shape deterrence, how we act, will inform Chinese nuclear buildup or the way China is engaging in arms control and risk reduction in the future.
Maybe this compartmentalization also the strategy to engage China to get it on board. So on this positive, optimistic note, I'm opening the floor for the questions from the audience. And I'll take the questions from your seats, but then I'll ask you to go to the fixed microphone in the middle. So start from there, and yeah. Okay.
Hello, Tomasz Szmura, Kazimierz Płaski Foundation Warsaw Security Forum. I've got a question to Assistant Secretary General Lapsley on the nuclear sharing, of course. Probably you might hear that advisor to the President of Poland today informed that Poland will be willing to contribute more to nuclear sharing as we in the process of the procurement of F-35, still having a significant fleet of F-16. You are working, on the daily basis with the allies, nuclear sharing participants. So what are the moods in NATO HQ in this particular topic? Do you think that this approach is welcome or not really? And if such kind of contribution, it's welcome and expected. Thank you.
We'll take another question and one from the Slido, and then I'll let you answer, and then we'll have a second round. So there was a gentleman who just went there. So could you please? Okay, no, not you. Yeah, the one who is closer to me. Yeah, right. Sorry.
Absolutely. Erwan Lagadek from the Atlantic Council and George Washington University. A couple of quick things. Is it your view that the US and the UK especially have been true to the Budapest Memorandum in terms of its deterrence value vis-à-vis the Ukrainian decision to get rid of their post-Soviet nuclear weapons? And number two, we are seeing an increasing number of media pieces about the influence of the Orthodox establishment vis-à-vis the doctrine of nuclear weapons use. In fact, there's a new book about the way in which the far right in Russia is increasingly influenced by Orthodox millenarian thinking about using nukes. Do you think there is value to that, or should we in fact be on the lookout for Russia planting stories about the Orthodox Church pushing for a much more aggressive doctrine on nuclear weapons as a way to use the madman theory of nuclear doctrine? Thanks.
And this question goes to whom? To all the panelists. Okay. And the last question comes from Slido regarding nuclear weapons in Belarus. Does NATO perceive this as imbalance in deterrence, which consequently requires the deployment of nuclear weapons to Eastern Europe? So we'll start probably with Angus and then Nicola.
Well, on the question on Poland, actually, I thought your question had all the elements of the answer in it. Poland is part of the nuclear planning group, which is the body of NATO ministers minus France, which has a special status, which decides nuclear posture and nuclear policy, and it's a very active member of that group. Poland is deciding what the future should be. As you brought out, as Poland develops an F-35 force, along with many other countries in Northern Europe, it becomes a very potent contributor to how we maintain not just nuclear deterrence, but conventional deterrence. And I would strongly agree with what Nicola said earlier, that actually the best way to avoid ever getting into the situation where we need nuclear deterrence is to have strong conventional deterrence in the first place. And on Belarus, I would say we are very confident that our own nuclear deterrence vis-a-vis Russia is holding and is right for the threat that we face. And moving nuclear weapons into Belarus would be an irresponsible step. There's no justification for it, but it would not weaken our ability to deter an attack on NATO. We're very clear about that.
Thank you, Nicola.
Yes, I think there are two things. First of all, about the violations of the of Budapest by Russia. It's absolutely true that it was absolutely not acceptable, but that was part of the weak responses of the West that are already described after, all the massacres committed by Russia, in Georgia, mostly in Syria, and in Ukraine. And I think the lack of response was certainly the bad signal, because, as in Syria, at that time, I think that the questions of the nuclear blackmail was not, real, just this one. It was not a nuclear blackmail at that time. And in fact, the fact is that basically we were as weak because we feared, I don't know what exactly. Coming about, very interesting questions about the so-called Orthodox Church of Russia. So-called, because that has nothing to do with the church, in my view, and with the values of the Bible or anything like this. But which is absolutely true is that we are witnessing, a kind of mood since more than 30 years, in fact, in Russia, of this kind of millenarist narratives. The cult of the death is something very frequent. We have, of course, some priests who were basically praising, all the massacres and the war crimes against humanity of the Russian soldiers, in Ukraine. And you have, sorry, I wrote a long piece about that, so I won't be long now. There is, this very ideology of Putin, which is based on destructions. Not only the destructions of the Chechens, the Syrians, the Georgians, the Ukrainians, etc., but the destructions of its own people. And I think we have certainly to pay a great deal of attention to ideology, because also mafia guys could have an ideology for their own purposes, and we must not forget that. Just a very quick word on Belarus. I think we have also to remind, first of all, that it is another violation of the Budapest Memorandum. And the second thing is a true violation as well of the constitutions of Belarus and Declaration of Independence.
Thank you. Julia, what's your take?
I will probably skip the question about the Orthodox Church because I don't know enough about it. Maybe also on nuclear weapons in Belarus or nuclear weapons eastwards, broadening the DCA mission. First of all, I don't think nuclear weapons in Belarus are changing the calculus or changing the overall strategic thinking. We've already discussed that NATO nuclear deterrence works. So I think that's the baseline. And then two things that I would like to add. First of all, I don't think we should fall into the trap of tit-for-tat strategy. So what Russia is doing, and starting with, again, with Zaporizhzhia, with very vague or explicit threats around the use of a tactical nuclear weapon, to allegations against Ukraine of using a dirty bomb. Russia is trying to create a very confusing, very fog of war-like nuclear scenario. And I think the best choice for NATO is to stick to the very strong and effective nuclear strategy that it has, which is based on coherence, it is based on consistency. So I would really warn anyone to fall into that tit-for-tat strategy. And then last point, maybe looking a bit at the broader picture, if we talk about about additional deployment countries for NATO nuclear weapons, we will certainly, the West will certainly have to answer questions in the Non-Proliferation Treaty conferences. That might not sound very relevant for this forum, but I can tell you why it is relevant. Because as West, we are not, in terms of population, the majority of the global population. So there are many countries on the brink, and our interest is that Russia doesn't gain supporters over the longer term. We don't want Russia to be surrounded by states in the global south. So we should be very careful how we behave in different formats because they are all connected. So if there are questions in the NPT regarding that issue, I think we risk that basis of support for Ukraine. That's very much looking at the broader picture, but and I know we're running out of time, but I think it makes sense to think about the wider implications.
Thank you very much. So I think that major takeaways is that nuclear is very dangerous, so we have to be careful with nuclear, and first of all, we have to be careful and not get involved in this tit-for-tat strategy, because it might lead us on very dangerous path. But it is important to be prepared and not to be too complacent, to adapt, to rethink our posture, but not also to succumb to nuclear saber rattling and be resilient vis-à-vis nuclear saber rattling, monitor but not overreact, and also reassure the societies, which also react in a very sometimes hysteric way, because nuclear is dangerous and very toxic. And although there is no probably room today for arms control negotiations, but we will have to come back to these negotiations when the war is over. And as Julia suggested, probably these conversations have to be compartmentalized, and it's not only taking Russia on board, but also China and potentially other players. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me close this panel and thank our wonderful panelists. Thank you very much.
Now, a short announcement that the session we were supposed to have at 16:40 may be moved to tomorrow. And the second one, we are going to have a coffee break, long-awaited coffee break, 20 minutes. After that, we will go live with Washington, D.C. Please be back in 20 minutes.
Well, hello everyone. I'm Maria Yefrosinina. I'm the Ukrainian journalist, and I'm now standing in Vilnius, Lithuania, actually in the YouTube studio, which is streaming from the public forum of NATO. And I'm very, very happy and honored to welcome here in the studio the Prime Minister of Latvia, Mr. Krišjānis Kariņš. Am I right?
Perfect.
Perfect, it's very good. And let me start with thank you from all the Ukrainian people to you in your help and support to Ukrainians. And you know that the whole people of our country is keeping eyes now on what's going on here in Vilnius. And could you please, I know that we have only a couple of minutes, could you please tell me all your personal expectations from this forum for Ukraine?
Within NATO, it's no secret there are various approaches in thinking about Ukraine and NATO. Good news is, in terms of support for Ukraine with weapons, ammunitions, money, humanitarian aid, etc., there is complete universality. Everyone is fully committed and will continue to support Ukraine as long as it takes. There's no question about that. This is actually very, very good news. That is, the longer the war goes on, the more committed everyone is to helping Ukraine. So it does not become weaker, it actually becomes stronger. So the will among NATO members is very clear. Then is the question of when and how does Ukraine become a member of NATO? Mm-hmm. And there are countries such as mine that thinks it's very simple and obvious. Ukraine must become part of NATO in order for there to be peace, not only in Ukraine but in Europe, because fighting a war costs lives, it causes damage, it costs money, and supporting a peace is completely different. And NATO is the only credible guarantor of peace in Europe, and Russia knows this. So the only question is what kind of decision we will have, what the actual wording will be. The sentiment is actually quite universal. Of course, it was said many years ago that Ukraine must be or should be in NATO. But now it's coming down to, okay, now how do we actually move in that direction? We've been saying it for many years, but how do we actually move in that direction? So there will be still some discussions about that. But to me, it's almost, I could say, it's not almost, it is actually
black and white. I heard your position on the panel. It's one of the most exact and very straight. And actually what is Latvia showing us is that since the beginning of war, your country has spent 1.3% of ITS GDP to help Ukraine. How can we persuade, for example, all the European countries to make such a great support to us? You did it, you managed.
We're still doing it. And what the interesting thing is in our country, when the government, and almost every week in government, we're making new decisions on what kind of aid is going to Ukraine. It comes from the military, it comes from the health ministry, it comes from the interior ministry. After the exploding of the dam, then there were generators, and our services are in contact with your services. What do you need? What do we have? What can we get? But civil society in Latvia is doing the same. And as the government is making decisions, I'm looking, we have all the time convoys of lorries going to Ukraine with everything under the sun. The civilians are not sending weapons.